Hi, welcome everyone. We'll let it give it another 30 seconds or so before beginning to give people time to join. All right, let's get started. Welcome to the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction's Friday Forum for Friday, August 18th, 2023. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer, Dr. Keith Porter. This is one in a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research or other useful knowledge related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. Last time, we brought you Dr. Louise Arnault of the University of Saskatchewan in Canmore and Dr. Alain Pietraniro of the University of Calgary, and they told us about their work to unify operational flood forecasting under a single national framework. Their slides and video are available at ICLR's website, www.iclr.org/workshops. Next time on September 8th, 2023, Brenna Miesenhall and Ian Giamonco will give us a talk entitled Small Hail, Big Problems. Their talk is going to challenge the notion that only the biggest hailstones matter to roof damage. I'm very much looking forward to that. But I have also been looking forward to today's talk for several months. Today's speaker is Dr. Tiegan Hobbs. She's a research scientist at the Geological Survey of Canada. She also holds adjunct professorships at 2 BC universities. She's an expert in active faulting, and she has exciting-looking publications about the physics of seismic wave propagation, about the structure of the Earth's crust, and other publications that I, as an earthquake engineer, have been nerding out on. But the most important thing about her background for today's purposes is that she is the scientific lead of the National Seismic Risk Model, which matters both for planning for future earthquakes and for responding to earthquakes that just happened. Dr. Hobbs will tell us today about that National Seismic Risk Model. It's computer software and data to estimate losses in future earthquakes. What I find particularly exciting about the model is the RiskProfiler, which is a user interface part of the model for non-experts like us to quickly explore important aspects of potential future earthquakes. Pick an earthquake scenario, and you can learn about ground shaking and building damage and the benefits of seismic retrofit. It's a wonderful tool. I had a hand in building some popular earthquake models, and I've played with many others, but I find that the RiskProfiler user interface beats them all for clear, easily accessible earthquake risk information. So I urge you to pay particular attention to that part of Dr. Hobbs' talk. Before she begins, here's our agenda. Our webinar will last 90 minutes. Our speaker will present for about half that time, then I will moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box. I'll try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. We don't use the chat box here. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question, then I'll move on to others, then I'll circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded, and ICLR will post our speaker's slides and a link to the video on Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who couldn't attend today, please let them know. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Hobbs. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the warm welcome, and thank you to everyone for being here today. It's really a privilege to get to present to you, as well as to hear your questions and chat more about the model after my presentation. So as Keith has mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the National Risk Model for Canada, but I want to highlight that this work is really not done in isolation. We're part of a team. Some of us are working directly on the risk model, and then I'm also showing here other folks who are working on things like First Nations engagement, seismic hazard assessment, earthquake early warning. Some of these topics I'll talk more about as we go through the presentation today. So I wanted to start by sort of briefly highlighting what is our role. So I'm a research scientist at the Geological Survey of Canada, as Keith mentioned, and we have a mission to provide authoritative geoscience knowledge to inform the stewardship of Canada's onshore and offshore lands to sustain responsible resource development for future generations. And this is the part that applies most to me, to keep Canada safe from natural hazards and related risks. So this is sort of the starting point. And it's also important to think about it. We have to do this not only just in one city or in one location, but all across Canada. So it's a bit of a large goal. So now let's start to think about how we're going to apply that sort of mission into the seismic risk context. So just a really brief primer for those who may work in other hazards. So we know that in all hazards, when we think about risk, it's going to be the combination of the hazard itself, the exposure, as well as the vulnerability. When it comes to earthquake risk, the way we think about that is that our hazard is made up of either maybe one earthquake rupture if we just want to look at a single scenario, or the combination of many earthquake ruptures if we're looking in a more of a probabilistic sense. And then we know that those ruptures, the earthquake shaking, or the waves, will propagate outward, these seismic waves, to some spot that we might care about, some site of interest. And so the way that those waves propagate is going to be important, as well as the site response, or the amount of ground shaking that you're going to have at the Earth's surface at your site of interest. And all of that collectively is what we would call the hazard for an earthquake. Our exposure, of course, like with other perils, is going to be kind of who and what are in harm's way. So we're going to need information about what kind of buildings are in different locations, when they were made, what they're constructed of, who lives in them at which times of day, and what's the kind of primary function of those buildings, and therefore the activity of those occupants. The last thing we need to think about is the vulnerability. So that's some measure of how likely you are to see damage or financial losses or other losses of interest in your exposed assets from your hazard. So it kind of ties everything together. And in this case, we tend to use functions that will relate the amount of shaking at a site of interest to the amount of damage or loss that you would expect to see for different types of assets. So let's kind of go through those piece by piece. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about our seismic hazard model that we have here in Canada. And I'll highlight that this is work done by my colleagues at the Hazards Information Service, which is also within Natural Resources Canada. So we have this is kind of just a really quick primer on our seismic hazard model. And you'll see on the left-hand side here, we've got a map of Canada showing earthquakes. I think this is over the last about 100 years. And what we tend to see is that on the west coast of, or the western portion of Canada, we have quite a lot of seismicity that's happening. It's happening quite regularly, even if we don't always feel it, because our cities aren't necessarily in the exact same spots where all these dots are, the different earthquakes. And then if we look in the eastern part of Canada, we see that it's generally a little bit more diffuse. We don't have quite as much seismicity, but where it occurs, it tends to be sort of clustered in areas like the Arctic up in here, sort of this Grand Banks area where we had a 1929 event that was quite significant. And then along the sort of St. Lawrence lowlands and into the kind of Saguenay area and the Western Quebec seismic zone. And so you may be able to think of earthquakes that have happened in these regions. We know that we've had significant earthquakes under Montreal and in the kind of Charlevoix area near Quebec City. In Western Canada, we sort of often think about this big one, which would be a Cascadia megathrust earthquake, which could be around a magnitude 9. So those are sort of on the upper end of earthquakes that we can see anywhere in the world. They're very large. They might shake for several minutes with strong shaking. But we can also have other types of earthquakes. We could have shallow earthquakes that are important because if they happen quite near to a city, that's going to be very damaging, much like we would see in Eastern Canada. And we can also get in the West what we call intraslab earthquakes, which is where one tectonic plate is diving beneath the other. The top here would be the subduction zone, where we're going to see those megathrust earthquakes, the really big ones like we had in Japan in 2011. And then further down, the plate, as it's going down, actually starts being pulled into the Earth's crust. And that pulling can cause earthquakes under tension. And those earthquakes, while they tend to be quite deep, which means that they're not happening very close to our exposed assets, they can tend to be actually a little bit closer in Canada to the population centers. So for example, we could have one of these events that might be quite close to Vancouver, whereas the megathrust events tend to be a little bit further offshore and farther away from our major cities. So what do we do with this sort of general picture of where earthquakes are happening in Canada? Well, we want to translate it into some information that might be usable for people like earthquake engineers. So what we see on the right-hand side is one of the 2020 National Seismic Hazard maps. And so the red colors here are showing that we have a higher probability of shaking over some time period of interest. And the cooler, bluer colors mean that you have a lower probability of shaking or a lower expected shaking over your time period of interest. And so unsurprisingly, we see that we have generally high seismic hazard in Western Canada, particularly along the West Coast in Vancouver Island and the Haida Gwaii region. We also see some up in the Northwest in the Yukon. And then, just like I pointed out, we have kind of hot spots up in the Arctic, and then some important hot spots sort of along this St. Lawrence lowland and sort of following the border of Quebec around. This is not the first map. This is the 2020 version, but we generally have had seismic hazard models going back to the 1950s. These were more maybe basic earlier versions, but since about 2000, we've been updating them roughly every 5 years. This is important because it's tied directly into the building code process, where these seismic hazard models then become the basis for the seismic provisions within the National Building Code of Canada. And so those two processes are kind of intertwined. So what is the new information that's been incorporated in our latest 2020 seismic hazard model? One of the biggest changes has been in that Cascadia subduction zone. We have a new and more complete record of events that have happened going back in history. And so that helps give us a better understanding of exactly how often these really large events tend to occur. And we used to think it was about every 500 years, and now it's about I believe it's about 430 years. So that can have, it might sound subtle, but it can be an important change. We're also using the newest next generation ground motion models. So a ground motion model is just a model that relates that rupture to the shaking at the site. So it tells us about how the seismic waves are going to pass and how much shaking is ultimately going to be transferred to your site of interest. So it's important to always sort of include the most up-to-date information about how we think that shaking will be propagated. We're also incorporating a potentially active fault near Victoria, BC. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called the Leech River Fault, or the Leech River Valley Fault, sometimes it can be called. And this is important because it's a fairly shallow fault line that runs quite close to the city of Victoria. So obviously that's a major exposure area or a major city. And so we want to really understand if we think that there could be shaking very close to it. We also have improved confidence in how we're characterizing site amplification, and there have been some general model improvements in line with global best practices. So here's just a quick snapshot to show how things are looking. So on the left-hand side here, I'm showing the 5th generation, which is the 2015 model. And on the right-hand side, the 6th generation, which is the 2020 model. The color scales are just slightly different, but generally you'll notice that it looks roughly the same. So in the sense that where we had hazard before, we still have hazard. However, there has been a little change in the amount of hazard that we predict. So nearly all of the model changes have had the effect of increasing the seismic hazard. And they have conducted a study and found that these changes are maybe adding about 1% to the average new building cost across the country. So what we're looking at here is for 3 different major cities, how have the hazard levels, in this case, the spectral acceleration at 0.2 seconds, changed throughout time as the different seismic hazard models have evolved. And so we can see that there were kind of major jumps here in the mid 80s. And then again, in 2020, we're seeing that there's a bit of a jump in the amount of hazard that you would expect at all 3 different cities, whereas the last few revisions have been generally a little bit more modest in the change in hazard. However, the amount that the hazard has changed kind of depends. It's going to depend on things like which parameter you're looking at. So if you're looking at the spectral acceleration at a certain period, the hazard change might be different than if you looked at a different period, or if you were looking at the peak ground acceleration or velocity. It's also going to depend on location. We see that Eastern Canada, and particularly in the Maritimes, is where we're seeing the largest changes in the seismic hazard from 2015 to 2020. And it'll also depend on the site class. So if you have a soil that is maybe a thick package of sort of poorly consolidated soils, it's going to behave very differently than if you have hard rock or very compressed soils. And those will also have an impact on how different the hazard is between 2020 and 2015. So now I'm going to turn over to more of the seismic risk model, which is the area that I kind of specialize in. I won't go too far into the details, but just wanted to sort of highlight some of the features and some of the challenges when we're making this model. So one of the biggest things that we have to worry about is taking that hazard model and making it simple enough that we can run it in a seismic risk model. And so I'll just highlight down here this 10 to the 5. So with our seismic hazard model, we have to make different choices about sort of what do we think the conditions are and what do we think earthquakes will be like. And the way that we handle that is to make logic trees like the one that I'm showing here. And so, for example, you might say we have 3 different sort of conceptual understandings for how earthquakes happen. And so, for example, the ones that we're showing here, the 3 different ones, is we're saying, well, maybe earthquakes in the future will be exactly like the earthquakes we've already recorded on our instruments. So, we've got maybe 100, 150 years of seismic recordings, and maybe that's good enough to sample what they'll be like in the future. So maybe our model should just say, take the seismicity we've recorded and project it into the future. Another conceptual understanding would be, well, maybe we're not catching the really big earthquakes because maybe they have very long recurrence intervals. Let's say an earthquake only happens every few thousand years. Well, we're not really going to catch it in 150 years. So maybe we should use our understanding of where the major fault lines are, our knowledge of prehistorical earthquakes that have occurred from geological observations, and we should let that tell us where the earthquakes are going to be in the future. And then a third conceptual model would be, well, maybe it's a bit of both. Maybe the major earthquakes are going to be in places that we can identify using our understanding of tectonics and geology, and maybe the little earthquakes are probably going to look like the ones we've already seen from our seismic observations. And so what we would do is take each of those 3 conceptual understandings, each of which might be right, and give them a different weighting in our logic tree and say it could be any of those 3 options, and we weight them perhaps differently based on how likely we think they are. And you could do the same thing with parameters like the maximum magnitude, the magnitude recurrence, which tells you how often earthquakes are going to occur, or even different ground motion models, where one researcher might say, I think the waves are going to propagate like this. Another researcher would say, I think they're going to propagate a little bit differently. And we think both of them could be right. So we're going to keep both of those in our logic tree. The problem becomes that the seismic hazard model for Canada has 10 to the 5 total branches in the full logic tree. So that's a lot of different branches. And if you want to really understand the hazard and especially the risk, you'd want to sample as many of those branches as possible. But it's not really possible to sample 10 to the 5 branches or to sample them very robustly. And so we start to make a few simplifications in order to run our model. The first of which is to collapse down those maximum magnitude and magnitude recurrence down to their mean values. We also make a few choices about our ground motion models to say that maybe they would ideally be represented with different weights depending on which type of spectral acceleration you're considering. But for risk purposes, we're only looking at a couple of spectral accelerations that are really important for engineering or for our conceptualization of the engineering. And so we're not going to do that variable weighting. And we also bring everything together into just one national model instead of having different regional models. And so with all of these simplifications, we're able to get it down to about 24,000 total branches, which is still quite a lot, but it's much more tractable in our seismic risk model. If all of that was a little bit too jargon rich, the point is that we have to make some simplifications so we can take that hazard model and run it in our risk model. The next thing we want to think about is our site response. So this is where we want to say, what does the soil look like? Because we know that that soil will have a big impact on the amount of shaking and therefore the risk. So whereas with the seismic hazard model, they calculate the hazard at a number of different site conditions for each site. They say, well, we don't know what it is, so maybe it's site class A or site class B. We'll just calculate all of them and you can choose yourself. For the risk model, we want to sort of know that ahead of time and only calculate it once. And so we use this slope-based VS30 proxy. So what that's basically saying is it's a model from the USGS, which is the United States Geological Survey, that says, based on how steep a slope is, we can say something about the soil underneath. And so we're going to give you a measurement of the average shear wave velocity in the top 30 meters of the Earth's surface, which is also known as the VS30, for all around the world, just based on the slope. It's not a perfect proxy, and especially here in Canada, we know that in places that have been glaciated or where there's a lot of volcanic activity, that this proxy is like maybe especially not appropriate. And so this is one of the things we're looking at for our next revision of the model, is to take more specific geotechnical information. But for now, we can use this as a really helpful first step. Next, we want to start thinking about our exposure. So one of the things that my predecessor, Marie Journet, worked very hard on in order for us to be able to do this risk model was to build an exposure model for all of Canada, which is quite a daunting task because we're a huge country and our buildings are, sort of in small clusters over this really broad area. So in order to make this exposure model, the first step was to start at a sort of a remote sensing or Earth observation level. And to start looking at where, using the nighttime lights, we can figure out where are there buildings in Canada. And then once you have those buildings, we can make a geometry that we call the settled area. So it sort of matches with a census dissemination area, only it is it's not forced to be continuous across the entire country. We can just make boundaries around where there are actually houses, which is important when we're thinking about natural hazard work, because the hazard for census, they might want to lump big rural or remote areas all together because there's not very many people. But for a hazard, you might have a really different hazard at one edge of this large rural region or the other. So we want to make sure that our geometries allow us to appropriately calculate the seismic risk at a site. From there, we can use information about different land uses to determine sort of what's generally happening in each of these little areas. And then we use a representative building portfolio to say, we use a representative building portfolio where we say, these are the kinds of buildings that tend to occur in areas like that in this part of Canada. So we can create sort of a schema that will assign different building types that we know are probably in that area. And from that, we end up populating this exposure model for all of Canada. It was then fact-checked in certain different regions where we sort of knew what buildings should be there, and we could check and make sure that our model was doing a good job. In addition to this, what we call the physical exposure, we also have a social fabric model. And that's where we took basically different demographic variables. And there have been previous publications that identified which of these are really important for post-disaster recovery or for sort of disproportionate impacts from disasters. And so we took each of those demographics demographic types that was important, and then categorized every single neighborhood in Canada based on whether they were near to the average or quite far from the average on each of those demographics. For example, if we have a neighborhood that has, for example, many people living with quite low income, we know that low income can be a factor that makes it more difficult to recover from a major disaster or from any major shock. And so we could look at that and classify which neighborhoods in Canada tend to have a low income, and that would be one of our demographic variables for social vulnerability. We took about 20 of these different demographic variables, rolled them all up together to give us just one number that measures the social vulnerability all across Canada. And this is important because we're certainly not trying to say that one single number should be used to assess really complex vulnerability or to characterize groups of people. But when we look at a national level, we need something to help us understand, there are going to be some neighborhoods that really have a much stronger capacity to be resilient, and other neighborhoods that could really benefit from some proactive mitigation or some proactive investment. And it could be many things, not just income, things like not maybe speaking one of the two major languages. So after an earthquake, we start putting out materials to help people understand where they should go to seek aid, or where they could go to reunite with loved ones. And if it's only in English and French, and we have regions where people aren't speaking either of those languages, then we would want to know that so we could take a slightly different approach. And so that's where our social vulnerability model, we hope, can be most impactful, when we're sort of looking at a high level to just identify regions where we might need to take a slightly different approach. So in the end, we end up with what we're calling our building portfolio for all of Canada. We're classifying things based on different taxonomies or a taxonomy of different building construction materials. So things like whether it's primarily a wood resisting system or concrete. And then we also look at the occupancies. And each of these is broken down also into several different subcategories. For example, within residential, we would say, is it a residential single family home? Is it a multifamily duplex? Is it a multifamily apartment building? How many families are living in different sizes of apartment building? Or is it perhaps a motel or other temporary lodging? And that, again, is going to really help us to understand how these different places can be impacted by earthquakes. In the end, we end up with 2.2 million unique asset location combinations. So when we're starting to think about, okay, how are we going to run this risk model? Again, it's going to be a really big calculation, because that's quite a large number of sites that we need to run the risk calculation at. I just want to highlight, because depending on, maybe who might be in the audience today, if there are folks who are interested in using this exposure model, it is all publicly available. I'm happy to refer anyone to the publications. You can download the data, work with it yourself. And so just to highlight the kinds of things that are in this data set, in case there's anyone who's interested, we report on things like the land use types, whether it's residential, low, medium, or high density, commercial, industrial, mixed use, or rural. We're also reporting on, for each building, the location, occupancy, construction type, an approximate age, number of stories, finished floor area, population we have for daytime, nighttime, and in transit. And then the building value we break down into the structural and non-structural components, the contents of it, and an approximate retrofit cost. Again, I will just highlight, though, that this is a representative inventory. It's not a one-for-one inventory of Canadian buildings. So you can't go in here and find your exact house, but you could go to your neighborhood and find houses that are probably like yours in approximately the right number. And on the left-hand side here, I'm just showing the sort of general exposure map of Canada. So unsurprisingly, we're seeing it's really the major cities popping out. And then we have really low density as we head up into the Arctic and East Arctic. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our last piece of the risk puzzle, which is the fragility and vulnerability. Generally, when we're saying fragility, we mean how likely is a building to be damaged, and vulnerability, we're saying how likely is there to be loss. And like I mentioned, we have just these sort of mathematical equations based on engineering that tell us for a different intensity of shaking, which is the spectral acceleration here, for example, on the horizontal axis, what's the probability of exceeding different damage states? So these are different fragility functions for some of our most common building types here in Canada. And so it's saying that, for example, in this low code single family residential wood frame building at a spectral acceleration of 1G, we would have, quite a low probability of being in the extensive or complete damage state, but you might have quite a high probability of being in a slight damage state. And I also want to highlight that we do have an upcoming project with the United States Geological Survey and the Global Earthquake Model Foundation, where we're hoping to look into making kind of a unified set of these fragility and vulnerability functions for all of North America, just to sort of bring things together instead of having two groups working in different directions, and to also allow us to maybe update some of our fragility and vulnerability functions for Canadian specific building types, because we know that here in Canada, we built our wood buildings a little bit differently than they generally did in the US. The last thing I'll touch on is in terms of the risk components, is this idea of retrofitting. So For each of our buildings here in our exposure model, we've assigned them to a different code level. And that code level is generally based on what year was the building constructed. And these are kind of lumped by major changes in the building code. So pre-1972 building, 70s to late 80s, 1990 to about 2004, and then 2005 to present are sort of the different bins. And then it's also based on the level of seismic hazard in the region that the building exists. Because if you were building a brand new building in Winnipeg, you're probably not going to include significant seismic provisions, even though it's a brand new building. So you'd think that it would be a high code building. But because it's just not that important to put those provisions in, even if you construct a brand new building in Winnipeg tomorrow, it will still be a low code from our perspective in terms of the seismic hazard, the seismic rating. And so one thing that we did in our model was we run the model for the code level of the buildings as we believe they are, but then we also wanted to see, well, what would it look like if we retrofitted some of those buildings? So based on consultation with practicing engineers, they said that a retrofitted building would probably perform roughly like a moderate code building. And there's an exception where if you have unreinforced masonry, so sort of brick buildings, they tend to never really get retrofitted because, or if you retrofit them, it's going to be quite costly and it's really hard to bring them up to moderate or high code levels. And so those can probably only go up to low code. And then post-disaster buildings, so that might be something like a hospital or a specific like post-disaster emergency center. If you're going to retrofit those, you're probably going to retrofit them as high as you possibly can, because you want to ensure that that building is not only safe for everyone inside of it, but that it would actually retain its functionality after the earthquake. So those buildings we assume would go all the way up to a high code. And so based on this assumption, we do a second run of our model where we treat every building as though it's been retrofitted. And the idea here is not to say that we think it's realistic to retrofit every building in Canada, but more so to give users the opportunity to say, well, I'm really interested in, let's say, concrete buildings in Ottawa. You could go into our model, look at the results for Ottawa without any retrofit, just the baseline, what we think we actually have, and then compare those results for concrete buildings with the retrofitted versions. So by sort of zooming in on a specific area and a specific building type, it lets you look at sort of a high-level calculation of, well, how much safer would Ottawa or some neighborhood in Ottawa, you could get as granular as you kind of like, how much safer would it be if those buildings were retrofitted? Or you might be looking at how much would the loss diminish if those buildings were retrofitted? And so again, just to highlight, we think that this is really useful, but we want to be clear that we're not suggesting you should look at the full results for all of Canada and assume that that's a realistic retrofit. So now that we've done all this work, we know what our inputs to the model are going to be. We've started running our models. We want to do a quick quality check to make sure that nothing's really gone wrong along the way, like sort of a reality check, like do these results make sense? And so in our case, we're going to look at a few different metrics. One is, does our average annual loss, is it less than 0.5%? And the idea here was that the average annual loss expected in Nepal is 0.5%. And so if we are seeing losses greater than those in Nepal for average annual losses, we would consider that to be a bit sort of unlikely or unsettling. So that was something we wanted to check. We also wanted to know that the average annual loss ratio for wood is less than the average annual loss ratio for unreinforced masonry. Again, because we know that unreinforced masonry tends to perform more poorly than wood under earthquake shaking. We also wanted to check that our mean 500-year loss was less than 70% of the replacement value. Again, looking internationally, what are some helpful benchmarks? We said, well, the Christchurch earthquake in 2011, that was a shallow earthquake really near to a city center that had a lot of, sort of nice old unreinforced masonry buildings. And so there was a ton of damage in the central business district of Christchurch, and the damage rate for those unreinforced masonry historical buildings was about 70% of the replacement value. So if we saw that our 500-year loss, which for reference, the Christchurch earthquake is probably much, much higher than our 500-year losses should be. If our losses were greater than the highest loss ratio or loss rate in the central business district near this really large earthquake, that would say that something is wrong. The last thing is that we generally wanted to check that we're seeing our highest losses and damages in the places where we have high exposure and high hazard. So places like Southwest British Columbia and the St. Lawrence and Charlevoix regions. And for reference, we passed all of these checks, which gives us good confidence that we're generally seeing something that looks about right. I'm going to now switch over to talking about some of the results of this model, but I just want to highlight that for anyone who's interested in learning more about how we did this National Seismic Risk Model, we've got a publication in Earthquake Spectra that you're welcome to go and check out. And then there's also, we have sort of been putting all of our different documentation, all of our papers and open files onto this one website, RiskProfiler.ca, learn more additional documentation. And these slides will be available later, so no need to panic if you don't get a screenshot or anything of this right now. So now I'm going to highlight just a few of the results because a full presentation on them would be much longer than we have allotted here today. But hopefully this can sort of drive some conversation or get you interested. We do have a full paper on our risk results that we're working on right now, and we've got a couple of conference papers that will highlight these same figures that I'm showing here today. So firstly, there's kind of two ways to think about risk, which is very familiar for those who already work in this industry. But the one way would be using scenarios, which is a deterministic approach, where we say, for one individual earthquake, what do we expect the impacts to be? And the other would be looking at a probabilistic assessment, which is where we say, for all the earthquakes that are likely to occur or that might occur in some time period of interest, what is the cumulative impact from those events? Or you could look at the maximum expected impact from those events. And sort of like saying that you could look at car accidents, either in terms of one specific accident and what is the outcome of that one accident, or looking at what are your odds of getting into an accident every time you get in your car. Kind of the two different approaches. So today I'm going to mostly focus on the probabilistic assessment because that's sort of makes it easier to look at large regions, and it sort of takes away some of our biases about which events we think are most likely to happen or we think are most likely to be impactful, and really lets us look at the statistical average of things. Sorry, but of course, if I'll highlight later on how you can go and drill into all of these results and particularly the earthquake scenario results for yourself. So first, what I'm showing here is our expected 500-year loss broken down by the different provinces and territories. On the left-hand side, I'm showing the absolute loss in millions of dollars Canadian. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing the normalized loss, which in this case, I mean, I'm taking the absolute loss as shown on the left-hand side and dividing it by the total asset value in each of those provinces and territories. So for BC, I would say it's a $27 billion loss that we expect to see about every 500 years or over an average 500-year period. And I divide that by the total value of all assets in the province of British Columbia to see that that's a 1.93% loss that we would expect to see in 500 years. And I think this is important because it shows us what is maybe not so surprising, that our provinces that have the highest losses are going to be BC and Quebec, with Ontario in third place. But once we start looking at how those losses might compare to what's actually there, or a proportional loss, then it's British Columbia and Quebec, and actually the Yukon that ends up coming in third place. And I think it's important, and I'll touch on this a few times, that in Canada, we can look at where our absolute losses are, and they're usually going to be in places where we have a lot of people and assets. But if we look at the places that might stand to lose the most in a proportional sense, it's often going to be some of these smaller or more remote regions of Canada, such as the Yukon. Next up, what I'm showing here are the average annual losses and fatalities, and I'm breaking them down by kind of our most impactful cities, I'll call them, here in Canada. And so I apologize for showing this, full wall of text, but we'll walk through it. So like I said, we're breaking it down by different cities. And then at the bottom, I'm showing the national total. In this column here, AAL, I'm showing the average annual losses, the absolute losses. So these are financial values. And then the AAL fraction of total. What I mean here is that I'm taking this average annual loss value and dividing it by the national total. And so this is not a loss ratio, it's just the losses as a fraction of the total national loss for the average annual losses. And then Right here, we're showing the APLL, that's the average, or sorry, the annual probable life loss, or the average annual fatalities. Again, I'm showing the absolute value in here, and then dividing that absolute value by the national total in the column on the right-hand side. And so what we are showing here, or what we see here, is that it's actually only a few cities that eat up the sort of a large portion of our national average annual loss and average annual fatalities. And so, example, we could look here and see that Montreal and Vancouver have about 17% of our national average annual loss, despite being only just well, they're not small, but two cities. And for reference here, I'm only taking like the city of Vancouver proper. This is not Metro Vancouver. If we look at the average annual fatalities, it's a very similar story. It's actually even more extreme, where again, we've got about just over 17% between just two cities. What I also want to highlight on this table is that Montreal actually comes out ahead in both metrics. And I think that's something we can sort of gloss over because we're so used to thinking about Western Canada as having such a large share of the seismic risk. And certainly BC is beating Quebec in terms of seismic risk. But when we actually start looking at individual cities, it's Montreal often comes out just a little bit ahead of Vancouver by some of the metrics we've been looking at. However, I'll highlight that if we were to start including the Metro Vancouver region and start putting in the suburbs, then Vancouver would come out ahead, because you'll notice that on this list of our kind of top most impactful cities, Surrey, Richmond, and Burnaby are all suburbs of Vancouver, and Abbotsford is sort of a more distant suburb, but it's still part of the sort of lower mainland Fraser Valley region. I'll also highlight that both Ottawa and Toronto make it onto this list. Toronto, of course, is, I would say does not have, it has much lower seismic hazard than many of these other cities, but because we just have such a large concentration of exposed assets and people in that spot, it still tends to pop up when we're doing our national analyses and looking at the absolute values of things. This next chart that I'm going to show, again, we'll walk through it. I know it's a little bit busy. What we're looking at is, again, the average annual losses and the average annual fatalities, except now instead of breaking them down by cities, we're going to look at them by construction type and by seismic code level. So again, this code level, that was when I was saying what year was it built and what area is it built in? Is it a high seismic code building or HC? Is it a pre-code building? So kind of before we had any robust seismic provisions in our national building code, which would be pre-code or PC, LC is low code, MC is mid-code. And then the farthest right column that we're looking at here is the total exposed value. That's not a result of our seismic risk model. That's just me showing for reference what is in our exposure model so that we can compare some of the results. So when we look at the left-hand side here, we're looking at the average annual losses. We see that about 65% of our average annual losses are coming from wood-framed buildings. This is, I think, maybe a little bit counterintuitive for some of us because we think of wood as being a really safe seismic construction material. And it is, but we have so much wood here in Canada. If we compare this with our total exposed value, you'll see that 60% of our building stock is made of wood buildings. And so it sort of makes sense that we just have so much wood, and wood can still sustain slight damages, and some of those slight damages might still have a financial impact. And so even though we know that wood is generally a good performer, if we are really just thinking about the financial impact of earthquakes, wood is still a material that we sort of need to keep our eyes on, or we need to think about proactive measures that we could take. If we look at the average annual fatalities, it's a very different story. So here we can see that concrete and unreinforced masonry are kind of our two deadliest construction materials in terms of seismic safety. Together, they make up 49% of our average annual fatalities, despite the fact that in our exposure model, they make up about 21% of our exposure. Steel and reinforced masonry come in third and fourth place, despite the fact that they each make up only 8% of our exposure. And so what this is telling us is that when we're thinking about, okay, we've got this risk model, how do we start reducing our risk? It sort of depends on what our goal is. If our goal is to diminish the likelihood of major financial impacts or financial contagion, then maybe we're looking more at wood. Maybe we might think about a wood frame policy or or approach that would encourage single-family homeowners to retrofit their buildings. Whereas if we're thinking about fatalities, then we might really be focusing on some of these larger commercial industrial structures or sort of older concrete and reinforced masonry residential buildings. The reason I say older is that if we start looking down here at this bottom row, we'll notice that 77% of our average annual fatalities are coming from pre-code buildings. So those are generally about pre-1970s buildings. And this is really important because that's not matched in our exposure. 50% of our buildings are pre-code, whereas a really higher than expected proportion are driving up our fatalities. And I'll also highlight that if we were to look at our pre-code unreinforced masonry concrete buildings in Canada, they make up only about 8% of our total building stock. Whereas if we were to look at the pre-code unreinforced masonry and concrete buildings in only our sort of most impactful cities, then it would be limited to only about 1% of our building stock. And so these are the kinds of things that we hope we can draw out from this risk model to say, where are we going to maybe get the most bang for our buck if we did want to think about retrofitting buildings? And I think this is a perfect example where we can see that these buildings are maybe not the most safe, and we can identify that it's a fairly small portion of our total building stock. So maybe it is, those are the kinds of times where maybe you could start thinking about a retrofit strategy or an existing building strategy. So now moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about this risk to life. So what we're looking at on the left-hand side is your probability of dying in a building in each of these major cities or anywhere in Canada. So we took every single building and found what's the probability of fatality within that building. And now we're just sort of plotting them as blobs, basically. So every building is represented within these blobs. And so then we can compare that to other risks that we might be a little bit more familiar with. So things like your odds of being killed in a motor vehicle accident, your odds of drowning in a pool, or your odds of being killed by a lightning strike. And so reassuringly, what we see is that your odds of dying in a building in Canada from an earthquake are generally somewhere between your odds of drowning in a pool or your odds of being killed by lightning, which are both risks that generally people are pretty comfortable with taking. Those aren't things that occupy a lot of our thoughts that we might be at risk of those. And so what this tells us is that the individual risk to life in Canada is probably a little bit acceptable. I use that word very cautiously. But this tells us that it doesn't really compare to the risk of dying in a motor vehicle accident, which a lot of people might think of as sort of the threshold for acceptability, or maybe, it's a risk that many of us are comfortable with taking. However, when we start looking at the group risk, which is what we're showing on the right-hand side here, this is basically a loss exceedance curve, but for fatalities instead of financial losses. And so we're looking at the annual frequency of a certain number of fatalities on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is the number of fatalities. And so each of these lines is a different one of our most impactful cities in Canada. And these diagonal lines are showing us sort of different thresholds of annual probable life loss. And so what we're saying here is that anything that plots up and to the right of this annual probable life loss of 0.01 tends to be what we might consider to be unacceptable. Basically, this metric is determined for dam safety, and it tells us that anything that's higher than that, if it were a dam, we would say it's an unsafe risk. And so what this is telling us overall on this slide is that while the individual risk of dying in an earthquake in Canada might be sort of acceptable, the risk that a large group of people will be killed or will have a mass casualty event from an earthquake in Canada is still unacceptable. And so again, we can think about, well, what does that mean for reducing risk? Are we going to leave it up to sort of individuals to make sure that they're making their homes safer because they are individually compelled? Or do we have to look at, well, an individual risk might be low, but people are definitely not going to accept a mass casualty event that might kill 1,000 people or more. And so what do we need to do at a higher level to ensure that we don't have those mass casualty events? And it might still be that we need homeowners to make their houses safer, but the way we come about it might need to be a little bit different. Last thing I'm going to present on is what we're calling our seismic risk index. So this is the one slide where we're not only looking at the physical risk of what's the probability of loss or damage or some impact, but also we're taking into account that social vulnerability that I mentioned to say, what's the impact, but also what's the ability to withstand that impact for different neighborhoods across Canada. And so we calculate the seismic risk index as the product of the basically the average losses and the social vulnerability. And we go into the math of that in our publications, and I'm happy to talk more about it, but it's based on an approach that's been set by FEMA. And so on the left-hand side here, I'm showing the absolute risk broken down into these sort of qualitative rankings of very low to very high. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at the normalized risk, where instead of taking the average losses, we're looking at the average loss ratios. And again, it's broken down into these qualitative rankings. And so what we'll notice on the left-hand side in terms of the absolute risk is that it's mostly the major cities that are popping out in the east and in the west. So places like Quebec City, Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto. And in the west, a little bit near Calgary, actually, and then mostly focused in Vancouver and Victoria. However, when we start looking at that normalized risk, we're going to see that it's almost no cities. All of our risk has now been transferred into much more rural and remote regions, and it's especially been transferred into those rural and remote regions in Western Canada. So in places like the Yukon, like I don't even know, I couldn't name a single town probably up in some of these regions, but we see that they have the highest normalized seismic risk index when we start to include things like social vulnerability. And especially most of Vancouver Island is now popping out with a high score, as well as Haida Gwaii. So again, it's just when we think about how we want to reduce risk, I think it's important to keep both of these lenses in mind of what's the biggest risk to Canada as a whole, and it's probably the absolute risk from these major cities. But when we think about, maybe reducing suffering and reducing impact to individuals, we might be looking more at some of these rural regions that might have, the losses might be very high. I think of it just like if you lose 10 buildings in the city of Vancouver, that's not great. Don't get me wrong, 10 buildings is a lot. It would be a really big deal. But losing 10 buildings in a community that has 15 buildings can be much different, because now maybe you don't even have a place to put the people who are displaced from those 10 buildings. It could be winter, it could be cold. It gets much more complicated. So to quickly summarize some of the findings of our national risk assessment, we see that it's a handful of communities that have really disproportionately high risk, and that sort of are holding all the risk in Canada in an absolute sense. And they're Montreal, Vancouver, Surrey, Richmond, Victoria, Ottawa, and Toronto are the ones that pop up. We also like to highlight that Eastern Canada, I think, has a higher risk than is appreciated by the public and possibly even by risk professionals like myself. We're sort of used to looking at the West Coast, but we see repeatedly that Montreal actually comes out a little bit ahead. And we know from work by people like Katsu Goda that the perception of risk is much lower in Eastern Canada, and that insurance penetration is much lower in Eastern Canada. So I hope that these results can help to sort of start driving us towards a bit of a change in that. We also noticed that there's a really high relative risk in small communities, especially in Western Canada, and that's with and without including the social vulnerability. And generally across the board, in the probabilistic or deterministic sense, we're really consistently seeing that it's pre-1970s buildings that are really driving up our fatalities. So these pre-code buildings, especially in concrete and unreinforced masonry when we're thinking about fatalities, and in wood when we're thinking about financial losses. So now I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the seismic risk reduction work that is occurring in Canada, or that will be occurring in the near future, including talking about this RiskProfiler portal. So we know that damaging earthquakes happen in Canada, and we can't stop or predict them. There's no way to predict earthquakes, but we can try to manage these risks. And some of the major tools that we're using here in Canada are things like policies like the National Building Code of Canada to ensure a high standard of building construction, informed land use planning about where we're going to put those buildings even once we start building them, regulation of insurance and reinsurance to think about transferring some of that risk. And then earthquake early warning is one of the new tools at our disposal that I wanted to highlight here today. So earthquake early warning, this little video I think will loop through. The idea with it is that you can get seconds to tens of seconds of warning before the arrival of strong shaking. I'll highlight that it doesn't predict an earthquake. It just says once an earthquake starts, if we can measure that it started over here near where the earthquake is actually rupturing, and we can send that message wirelessly to people over here before the really strong waves get to them, then they might have enough time to take some, sort of fast protective actions. It's never going to replace things like having safe buildings, but it can give us really valuable time to do things like park your hard drives, stop traffic onto bridges or through tunnels, divert planes from landing, slower stop trains, stop surgical procedures, stop elevators and open their doors, close valves and turn off heat sources, open firehouse and ambulance bay doors. I didn't even realize this was such a big problem, that the earthquake can damage the door and now you don't have your first response vehicles when you might need them most. As well as issue public warnings to drop cover and hold on. And we've seen that these kinds of technologies have been well used in places like Japan and I believe Chile as well, for decades, I think. And so it's going to be, I think, a really big advancement for Canada when our earthquake early warning network becomes operational. Provisionally, it should be operational sometime next year. And there will be an option for different infrastructure providers or sort of high acuity users to be able to subscribe to different automated features that could help with some of these actions that you don't really want to rely on a human to have to go and press the button to open the ambulance bay door. You just want that system to be working seamlessly. As soon as the earthquake is detected and the message is sent out, that ambulance bay door is going up. So lastly, I'll talk about our Risk Profiler website. And the idea here, we're really targeting this right now at land use planners, community planners, and emergency managers. So thinking about sort of this land use question, although, we're hopeful that it can still be beneficial to other stakeholders, and that hopefully in the future we can even do a better job of trying to tailor it to some of these other use cases. So these are just some screenshots. You're very welcome to go to the website yourself. It's RiskProfiler.ca. It's live right now. You can go check it out and explore. And it generally has two categories. One is for earthquake scenarios and one is for the probabilistic earthquake risk. So just like I said earlier, this is, a single event, and this is looking at the cumulative effect of all possible events over a time horizon of interest. So right now we're looking at the earthquake scenarios, and you can see we've got a map. We only have about 9 scenarios in here right now, but we have more that are sort of queued up, and we're just waiting to upload them into the website, and we're hoping to just keep adding to that over time. You can either search around in this interactive map to find the scenario that's of interest to you, or you can go through this list on the left-hand side that will give you a bit of information about the magnitude of the event and where it's located, as well as kind of the 3 Ds, which is the death, damage, and dollars, sort of a snapshot of the risk for each of these events. So now if I were to select, I selected a magnitude 7.3 earthquake on the Leech River fault zone. So that's that fault that I mentioned earlier in the presentation today that's quite near the city of Victoria. As you can see, this black dot here is the epicenter, and this is Victoria sort of at the bottom of this peninsula right here. And so you'll notice that we've now got, it's sort of just off screen, but a description of the earthquake that's meant to be aimed at a not super specialized or super technical audience, just a description of what it is and how relevant it might be to the nearby cities. And then you've got a bunch of different variables that you might like to explore. So whether they're related to shaking, injury, damage, or financial losses is just off screen. You can drop down one of these menus and then select, in this case, I've selected the number of buildings that are likely to collapse. And now that's what's being visualized here in these sort of yellow to red colors on the map on the right-hand side. This map is, again, interactive. So right now we're sort of zoomed out. So we're looking at our results by the census subdivision level, or about a municipality level. So you can see Vancouver is all just one color blob. If we were to zoom in further, that would break down into a sort of a neighborhood scale, or the census settled area, which roughly matches the census dissemination area. It's about a postal code size. And so we can see here that Victoria and Saanich are generally having the greatest impacts. If I were to hover over on the website, this legend at the bottom, it would tell me the exact values, or I could click here and it would again tell me the exact values. You'll also notice that we've got these charts here in the middle. So this is breaking down the variable that we're visualizing, which is number of buildings that are likely to collapse, by the building type, which is the construction material, the design level, and then also by occupancy. It's just off screen, so you can't see it here. And so what we're saying is in this case, which building types are most likely to collapse in this earthquake scenario? And we can see that concrete is sort of the highest value. We're looking right now at the general results. We could also toggle on the specific button, and then that would break it down, not just by concrete, but it would start telling us, okay, is it concrete moment frames, or is it concrete shear walls? Is it low rise, high rise, mid rise? And start to give us really much more detailed information that might be useful when you start thinking about maybe retrofits or other policies. For design level, again, we see it's pre-code buildings really driving up the number of collapses. And with occupancy, we'd be able to see sort of which building uses are also tending to be the most collapsed buildings. The last thing I'll highlight on this page is that you can also, over here, we've got some toggles. You can tour the page if it's your first time or second or third time using it and you'd like a tour. You can also toggle on and off these charts. If you don't want these charts in the middle, you can make them go away. And then this last toggle says retrofit. And this is what I was talking about before, where if you wanted to know, let's say that, we know that concrete buildings are they're driving up our number of collapsed buildings. And I'm, let's say, wanting to know, well, what if I started to retrofit concrete buildings? You could turn on this retrofit button and see this number decrease. And you could start to say, okay, like, let's say it's about 150 collapsed concrete buildings from this scenario. But if I retrofitted, it would only be 50 collapsed buildings from concrete. Is that enough of a change that I might be able to, that's something I'd like to act on? You could, again, this is where that specific button might also come into play, because likely if you're thinking about a retrofit strategy, you probably want to really dial into a specific building type. So let's say I want to know if retrofitting shear wall, high-rise concrete buildings constructed before the 1970s would make a big difference in the overall risk for this earthquake scenario. That's a question you could answer using these two charts and this retrofit button. So we hope that this is really starting to give people the tools to think about what's the best way to reduce risk in Canada, and how can we make good quantitative cases for those different actions. I'll just show one snapshot from the probabilistic side of RiskProfiler. So what we're looking at here, when you go to the probabilistic side, you'll see a long list of variables, and you have to pick one before you can get into the maps. So in this case, I wanted to look at the annual probability of fatality. And so now we can, again, we've got our map on the right-hand side. It's all colored by the annual probability of fatality, again, from these yellows to reds. You'll notice that because I zoomed in, it's now showing you that neighborhood view, like I mentioned before. So we're not just seeing Vancouver as a blob, but we've got every kind of little neighborhood within Vancouver. You can click on a specific spot to get the details. So this is at the forward sortation area, the first 3 digits of a postal code. And I've clicked on this one area where the annual probability is that very small number ending in 4. You can also click view details, which now shows us kind of a snapshot of the risk for that neighborhood or that city if we were zoomed out. And so it'll give you your seismic risk index score, like I was talking about. So this is where we're taking into account both the physical and social dimensions of risk in the absolute sense and also in the normalized or percentage impact. And we still have these qualitative scores as well. So we see that this neighborhood in Surrey, British Columbia has a very high score, both in terms of the absolute and the normalized seismic risk index. We can also look at the average annual fatalities, number of buildings with complete damage over a 50-year period, and the average annual economic losses, both all of these as sort of the absolute values and the ratio values. And then you'd also be able to look at a loss exceedance curve for that neighborhood. So the idea here is that hopefully we're putting sort of some of these probabilistic results out to give people the information they need. However, we do have more information than what we're able to put onto RiskProfiler. And so if you go to the download data or to the learn more, you'll be able to get to the different publications and data repositories where we host every part of our model that we're allowed to host. I believe right now we're still waiting on being able to make public some parts of the seismic hazard model that are just in the final stages of undergoing peer review and publication, which is a requirement for us as federal scientists before we can make our work public. But hopefully that should be up very soon. So then in general, our idea here is that we want everyone to be able to download all this data, use it, play with it, run your own models with it, and just sort of advance this work in Canada. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. My contact information is up here. And again, just really appreciate the opportunity to share some of this work.
Fabulous presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Hobbs. We have like 6 questions from our attendees, and I have 6 of my own. So I'll give you my first one, and then we'll go through the attendees, and I'll come back if there's time and ask you some of my other ones. The most pressing one, around slide 27, you start talking about policy. You know, if we want to do mitigation and stuff, if we want to deal with life loss, if we want to deal with property loss, I'd like to know what agencies are you thinking about? What government agencies or what other kind of programs are you thinking about that exist and you've spoken with and that are prepared to take these results and run with them? I mean, let me frame my question a little bit more. In California, there's the California Earthquake Authority that has been assiduously promoting earthquake brace and bolts retrofit across the state, and they have been funding it, and they advertise it, and they have really been going with it. And there's a number of cities around California that have been mandating retrofits for various vulnerable building types. So tell me, does Canada have similar financially endowed or interested bodies that are actually pushing to make a difference, at least that have been talking to you?
It's a great question. So it's a little bit tricky because as the Geological Survey of Canada, our role is to provide a base of evidence to decision makers, but not to make decisions, and not to push one way or the other. So I think like in my role, that makes it a little bit like I don't want to get too far outside of what I really focus on, which is just here's the evidence, and I hope people will do great things with it if they can, or let us know what they would need in order to do the work they need to do. I think there's also a bit of a difficulty, as I understand it, within Canada, in that, you know, we don't already have a California Earthquake Commission that's doing this work, and there maybe aren't others. There aren't, to my knowledge, there aren't cities in Canada or provinces that are already doing mandatory retrofits. And so I think it can be a little bit tricky to be the first one to do that and set the precedent in a new country. But I would say that I think the city of Vancouver has often, I think, taken a kind of a leading charge in terms of wanting to understand the seismic risk and think about how to best manage that. I think there's also really great work or sort of interesting work and interest that's happening within the Lower Mainland, where, you know, there's sort of groups that are trying to bring municipalities together to think about how do they reduce risk sort of communally. But this also could be my bias of I'm based out of Vancouver, so that's maybe where I'm tending to see more people or have, you know, easier networking with them. And then I think at a national level, like the National Research Council, the NRC, I know that they are quite interested in existing buildings. And so they've been for years now working on different strategies to screen existing buildings, to think about, okay, what would it take to actually, if we wanted to know which buildings even could benefit from a retrofit, how do we do that on a really large scale? And then how do we make it sort of hierarchical, where you would start with just a really low level screening, and then you'd identify buildings that need maybe an advanced screening, and it would consider things like, you know, is the building already slated for demolition in 10 years? So then maybe there's no point in retrofitting it. or, conversely, is it full of really critical people or assets? And then maybe we want to bump it up the list. So yeah, I think there's sort of the foundation of some of this work. And I think we're just hopeful in our sort of jurisdiction, if we can just contribute the tools that would help those people to evaluate whether it's a good path for them.
Oh, so I assume that what the National Research Council is looking at is something like the American model of FEMA P154 for screening, and then ASCE 41 for tiers of evaluation, like that.
I don't know well enough to answer that question, but my sense is yes.
All right. Sorry, that was a bit of an engineering nerdy question. Let me turn to our attendees today. An anonymous attendee asks, what's your estimated coverage on the National Exposure Model data set? And the questioner meant coverage in terms of fraction of all buildings.
I think that they're asking, like, what percentage of buildings are we actually representing in our model?
Yeah.
It's a bit of a tricky one because we're not, again, like, it's not an inventory of here's the buildings that actually exist. In terms of the total number of buildings, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head right now, but my sense is that we have about the right number of buildings in Canada, based on census data, which I will give the caveat that we know that census data is not necessarily complete, and that my understanding is that it does a particularly less good job in Indigenous communities where there might not be great sampling. So in terms of, yeah, our coverage, like, we probably have about the right number of buildings. We know that our valuation of all of our buildings in Canada is about right, compared to census and building costing tables that we've purchased. But none of it is the actual right building. Like, the building I'm standing in is not in our exposure model. The building any of us are standing in is not in there. So in that sense, zero. But we are sort of hoping, I think our hope or our ideal is that by the time we run the next version of our seismic risk model, which will be in approximately 2027, that there may be some existing building inventories that we could use, at least for residential and possibly commercial buildings in Canada, because that's really our goal. We're not exactly in the business of putting together exposure inventories, but they make such a big difference in the work that we're doing to make sure that we have correct ones. And we'd also love to see those inventories be made useful across different perils, because ideally the flood folks, we'd be working with the same inventory as them, and the same with folks who are interested in tsunami or wildfire or, you name it. It's nice. The goal would be to have kind of a harmonized exposure data set that's useful for all perils in Canada.
Great. Several more questions here. Kyle McKenzie asks, does the model include exposure to offshore seismic events via tsunami?
Great question. We do not consider any secondary perils in our model right now. This is just damage from the shaking of the earthquake alone. So it would include shaking from offshore events, but it wouldn't include the tsunami. There is some work that other folks are doing to think about tsunami risk in Canada. There have been a couple of sort of assessments. And I think that our goal is that, again, maybe for the next round or maybe in subsequent rounds of the risk model, we'd like to fold that capability in, because we know that the losses from those secondary perils can be pretty significant in comparison to the losses from the earthquake itself, especially, for example, the 2011 Japan earthquake and tsunami. In terms of fatalities, my understanding is that the fatalities from shaking were maybe around 1,000, and the fatalities from the tsunami were, I believe, around 17,000. So, that's certainly a case for really needing to have a good handle on secondary perils like tsunami or liquefaction, landslide, aftershocks, fire following, those kinds of things.
Great. Tim Harrigan asks, is there information on public versus private ownership of buildings?
In our model, we don't distinguish that directly. We do split things into commercial versus residential, and then we have categories for educational and government. So in theory, like if I were looking for publicly owned buildings, I'd be looking in education and government and probably saying all the other types, which I've got somewhere back here, all the other types are privately held. Yeah, in here.
Cool.
And yeah.
Okay. Let's see, I'm going to continue. I don't know if the anonymous attendee is the same one as before, so I'm going to assume that he or she is, and continue on to other questioners. Louis-Philippe Caron asks, can you give more details on how Toronto is exposed to earthquakes? Is this New Madrid related? And I think what Louis-Philippe is asking about, what are the crustal structures that pose a hazard in the Toronto area?
Yeah. So I'll just put up this map so that we can see sort of where Toronto is down here, just to highlight that it, you know, in a simplified sense, it certainly has much lower hazard than many of the other cities that we were talking about. In terms of the specific, like what's contributing to this, we do know that there is seismicity that runs kind of all along the St. Lawrence lowland and does continue down in towards the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are actually a failed rift zone. So that's where, you know, in the middle of the Atlantic right now, we have the Mid-Atlantic Rift, where the two plates are pulling themselves apart and new crust is being created in the middle. The Great Lakes tried to do that, and they weren't successful. So they started pulling themselves apart. We got these like low kind of basin regions. It failed. Things got squashed a little bit back together. And so we still have kind of, we call them inherited fault structures sometimes. So it means we have a fault structure that used to be active, you know, millions of years ago. And even though it's not part of a currently active tectonic environment, this is no longer a rift zone. But if you still have stresses that are acting on the crust, then some of those faults might end up back in a position that's favorable to fail. And so we know that those earthquakes don't tend to happen as often as they would in regions like Western Canada, where the stressing rate of the crust is really high. But we still get earthquakes in Eastern Canada. And so that those failed rift structures might be important for Toronto. We know that there are some, like I know that there are some sort of mapped faults in that region, and there's been some cool work by folks like Alex Peace and Jeremy Romando looking at which of those fault structures is well oriented to be sort of reactivated by the current stress field. So that I would sort of maybe refer you to look into that if that's something that's of interest. When we go, sorry, a little bit further up the St. Lawrence region, so no longer maybe talking about Toronto, then we also have features like the Great Meteor Hotspot Track, which I just think is kind of neat. So much like in Hawaii, we have a hotspot where it's just some piece of the mantle, the interior of the earth, that's really hot. And we don't necessarily know why, but it means that it's sort of blasting up through the crust and creating volcanoes, or just generally heat that can weaken the crust. And so we know that that's happening in Hawaii. We don't think about it as something that has or is happening under North America still, but places like Yellowstone, that's a spot where we have a hot spot. And then over in Eastern Canada, there is or was the Great Meteor Hotspot. And so it's thought that that might be something that contributes to seismicity that occurs in Eastern Canada, because it sort of can weaken the crust a little bit and might help to reactivate some older structures related to, sort of rifting along the St. Lawrence. And also we had a period a long time ago where we had a lot of accretion, which is like, basically we have pieces of the Earth's crust that get slammed into the sort of the continent of North America. And so that's something that's happened more recently in Western Canada, but a long time ago, it was happening in Eastern Canada too. And we used to have very tall mountains as a result. They've now been eroded away. But a lot of those structures, again, they're still there, just waiting for the day when they might be reactivated. So sorry, that is sort of a quick primer on the tectonic situation in Eastern Canada that gives us some of these inherited fault structures that might be the sources of the seismicity that occurs in Eastern Canada. It's sort of hard to know, frankly, because it's all bedrock, so we don't know how recently any of these faults might have been active, or we don't always know how recently they might have been active. And we know that if they are active, they're going to be on really long recurrence intervals. So, they're not happening just every day. So it's hard to catch them.
Okay. Let's see. Lindsay Collins asked a question that you answered. So I'm gonna modify Lindsay's question. Lindsay asked, "Do you consider liquefaction your risk analysis?" And you've already told us no. So tell us, what are your plans with regard to liquefaction?
That I'm happy to talk about that, because that is an area of big interest for us. So one of my colleagues, Philip Lesseur, he's another research scientist here, and that's sort of an area of expertise that he holds. So right now, he's doing a bit of preliminary work about sort of what has already been done and what might be different paths to allow us to calculate the probability of liquefaction, either from individual earthquake scenarios, which is sort of already doable. Like tools like HAZUS have already established that that's a possibility. But thinking about like, how can we do it in a way that is sort of, we feel very confident in the way that it's being calculated, and are there ways to extend that out to maybe more of a probabilistic approach, where we're not only looking at one individual scenario, but thinking about as a whole, what's the likelihood of liquefaction in these regions, given all the seismicity that might occur. So that's something that he's been working on and talking to public safety about, I believe, Public Safety Canada as well, and also talking with our collaborators at the Global Earthquake Model Foundation, because that's something that they also have an interest in, adding that functionality to the suite of tools that they produce.
Cool. Let's see, we've gone through, everybody's who's asked a question has gotten it asked for them. So I'm going to go around our second go around, and I get to start. I found around slide 11, you showed this jagged development over history of the design ground motions. You had this annotation, SAO2, having to do with the motion that short buildings feel, and it goes up and it goes down. I found that quite familiar from the United States. We see the same sort of thing in the development of US seismic codes, both in the seismicity, the models of seismicity, and in our models of how buildings perform. We assume they're stronger, then we assume they're weaker. We learn something anyway. The design requirements go up, they go down, all jaggedy, but over the long term, they continue upward. And when you're looking at a trend over decades, and they don't seem to asymptote. We're not at the end. We're not reaching at least in the United States, we're not reaching a point where, oh, finally we know everything about buildings, and the way we're designing now is the way we're going to design for the next forever because we've got it all right. And I see the same sort of thing in your in this chart. What I think that means is that 30 years from now, more likely than not, we'll find that our engineered buildings are under-designed, that they won't pass. The buildings that we're designing today will prove to be inadequate according to codes of a generation from now. That's just my impression. Do you agree, or what are your thoughts about that?
I'll caveat that, this is just my opinion. I don't speak for my organization on this. I would probably tend to agree that if we look at it and say, our understanding has only increased, and the more we understand, the more the hazard seems to go up. That just seems like, okay, well then naturally that will probably keep happening. I think it's a little bit, I would see it as a little premature to say, we've probably got it all figured out now this time, guys. So yes, I do anticipate that would continue. Of course, the ideal is that it doesn't, because I think nobody feels good to know that we've made this hazard model, we've changed the building code, and now 5 years later, the building that you just finished is already going to be out of date, or not up to a certain code. I do think I think that things that are likely to change, especially in the next handful or 10 or 15 years. I think there is a ton of work right now happening on active faulting, which we use that term to mean any fault that's been active since the last ice age, so about 12,000 years ago. And the idea here is like, you know, we see seismicity, but it's not, we don't always know which fault is causing it. And likewise, we're starting to identify faults that we may not see a ton of seismicity on them, but we can use geological techniques to sort of investigate those faults and find out that actually they have had major earthquakes, that they're not releasing little earthquakes all the time that we could monitor with our seismometers, but within the geologically recent last 12,000 years, they have had major earthquakes. And so those are kind of, I think, really interesting from a seismic hazard and risk perspective, because I would say, especially here in Canada, I think there's a lot more work to be done. And it's kind of actually a really hard spot to do this work because glaciers have come through and really eroded away a lot of our evidence that we might have used to know where these faults are and how active they are. And we have so much vegetation that a lot of the techniques that they can use in the Western US to identify these faults using satellite observations, we can't really do as easily, or, you know, just getting out and looking for a fault. Like, I've been out in the field and you could probably be standing on top of one, you wouldn't know because the vegetation rate is just so high here. So yeah, I would personally anticipate that probably in the next 10 years, we're going to have more faults that we're going to be discovering and saying, yes, there's evidence that these are active, and that's going to change our seismic hazard and risk. I've got a PhD student right now who is doing some work on, hypothetically, if certain faults were active, which we don't have evidence that they are right now, how does that change the seismic hazard in Vancouver? And it did make a difference to have those in. I think also our understanding of ground motions seems to change quite frequently. And that's just as we get more and better recordings of these earthquake ground motions, then our understanding changes. So I think as our instrumentation has improved, that has really, or I'm sure that's not the only reason, but yeah, so I think that will change. And then the last thing that I think will contribute to this is right now, our high code buildings, or a building code, is really focused around life safety. And I think that is maybe underappreciated in some circles. I'm getting opinionated here, but life safety doesn't mean that it doesn't cost you money to fix, and it doesn't even mean you can keep living in your house. And so our building code, you know, I think a lot of other countries are starting to think more about a design-based building code where, or, you know, they're starting to think about, well, what's the functionality of that building going to be after the earthquake? So I think if Canada goes in that same direction at some point, then there will inherently be a big jump in the building code, because we're no longer saying it just needs to probably not crush people inside. It needs to, you know, it needs to stay standing. We need to feel confident about this building. We need it to be able to maintain its functionality afterward. We need to diminish the number of engineers who are having to go around and do specialized inspections. Yeah, so I think, yeah, that could be a big change as well.
Okay, I think we've got time for one question and only a brief answer. Second question from an anonymous attendee is, looking at the probabilistic risk results, the uncertainty in Quebec appears to be significantly higher than British Columbia. The questioner asked, what's driving this large uncertainty? And wasn't quite sure to what the attendee was referring. Maybe it was the fact that the frequency versus severity chart for risk to life in Montreal reaches higher N values, numbers of deaths, than in Vancouver, but maybe speak to a little bit to uncertainty and high risk in Quebec. And you get like a minute.
Okay, I'll try to talk fast because I know I got too wordy this session. Generally, we're not really presenting on any of our uncertainty in the plots that I've shown here today. It's something that we're trying to figure out how to present the uncertainty in a way that faithfully represents what we actually know and don't know and how we characterize uncertainty. but it's still easy to understand for folks who, like, we want it to be understandable. So if you want more uncertainty information, you can download all of our data to look at the 5 and 95 percentile results. Right now, I'm just showing the means for everything. In terms of Eastern Canada, I wouldn't say that what we're showing here is that the uncertainty is higher. I guess, yeah, I don't think so. I would have to check the uncertainty though. But I think if what we're looking at here is just the fact that these slopes are a little bit shallower for places like Montreal and Ottawa, which are the blue and green lines, as opposed to these other lines, it's mostly just showing us that these we can get kind of these higher fatality events that might be occurring at different frequencies of occurrence. So again, it's just thinking about in Eastern Canada, we might have events that are occurring less frequently that can still be really damaging, whereas in Western Canada, those events might just occur a little bit more frequently. But in either case, it might be an unacceptable loss. Like it's too many fatalities.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a great talk. I wish we could continue with the rest of our questions, but we are out of time. I want to thank you again, Tiegan. That was a wonderful presentation, a lot of information. And I want to thank all of our attendees for your interest in coming to Friday Forum. Please come back next time on September 8th, where once again, Brenna Miesenhall and Ian Giamanco are going to give us a talk entitled Small Hail, Big Problems. And remember that Dr. Hobbs's slides and the video will be up on ICLR's webpage around Monday. And once again, that's www.iclr.org/workshops. And with that, I'm going to thank you and say goodbye, everybody.